So one of the interesting pieces of John is he has a really, well, he has a lot of struggles with the Pharisees and the religious leaders.
Hmm.
So tell us a little bit about kind of what to be on the lookout for as we look at John.
Yeah, when you read John's gospel, and I remember the very first time I went to the Holy Land, we there was a rabbi traveling with us, and she was reading John's gospel because as a rabbi, she doesn't really spend any time in the New Testament. So traveling with us prompted her to read the New Testament or read the Gospels, and I suggested that she start reading by reading John because I like it the most. And and so as she was reading it, I remember riding on the bus one day through somewhere in the countryside in Israel, and she leaned over and she said, "The Pharisees weren't villains, but I sense that they're villains in this story." And really, in the days of Jesus, the Pharisees weren't villains.
No, they were trying to preserve
That's
what
right.
was.
I mean, you have to remember, in the time of Jesus, Rome occupied Israel. And so the Israelite people, the Jewish people, were living in a land that was governed over by the Romans. Ultimately, their military was there. When Herod the Great is on the throne in the time of the birth of Jesus, and then his sons are on the throne following, Herod the Great is not from a Jewish family. He has come to power through basically the fight between Octavian and Mark Antony and all of them after the death of Julius Caesar. That's when Herod the Great has come to power. He is actually a descendant of the Edomite people, and so he is married into the Jewish people.
I mean, so where they come from Jacob, the Edomites come from Esau,
Right.
and so they're not part of the chosen group, and
No.
suddenly he's
the
in charge.
king. He's the king. And so the Jewish people have lost, in a way, control of their temple because that's the only thing that Herod could do to make them, well, in any way, subservient to him as a king, was he worked with Rome and they removed the lineage, the priestly dynasty that had ran the temple for so many generations. They were removed, and now the high priest, well, was appointed. At one point, Herod appointed his brother-in-law to be the high priest, who was 17 years old.
Well,
And fortunately, at least he was Jewish, but he was 17 years old and not of the priestly family. And so the Pharisees have come up and have come to power in the Jewish world during this time because they were the keepers of the law. They understood that from the earliest part of the Old Testament, God gave the law to his chosen people. And so from the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, and all the way through to the writing of the law and the development of the law through the years, it's the Pharisees who were in charge of keeping the law. And so that's why at times they do run up against Jesus,
Sure.
because Jesus is interpreting the law in one way while the Pharisees are interpreting it in a different.
And in a way, if we hadn't had the Pharisees, we would have probably never gotten to the point where we had Jesus being able to have an argument.
Right.
Because they preserved everything that was up until that moment.
Absolutely. They preserved not only the law, but they preserved the prophecies. And so they were some of the ones that kept people looking toward the day a Messiah would come. And they kept the people of Israel connected in a world that wasn't there, well, where they weren't in charge. And so the Pharisees weren't bad, but they did play a role in ultimately the crucifixion, in that they were some of the ones in the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council. They were the ones that said he's violated our law.
Right.
And so that was what led them then to hand him over to Pilate.
And this is a new thing that we see. Jesus and his followers would have said, this is the natural and next progression of Judaism. This is where it's supposed to go.
Right.
And
Messiah comes.
They said, no, this is not where it's supposed to go. And so that you start seeing that conflict.
Absolutely.
Even in Jesus' day, and then in John's day.
Right, because they truly did. Like we talked about John talking about the lamb that would be the one on the throne. They really wanted Messiah to rise up and come and drive Rome out of Israel. They wanted that Messiah. They didn't want the suffering servant that Isaiah prophesies. They want the conquering king. And so they love the story of the Maccabees, where Judas Maccabeus comes in and drives out the Greeks, drives out the Seleucids, and reforms the nation of Israel. That's what they wanted. And that wasn't Jesus.
That's not the
That's
the
not the
lamb.
lamb.
No.
And that's not the lamb that's coming to take away the sins of the world. And so there's a struggle with that. And then in the time of John, after Jesus has ascended into heaven, well, then the Pharisees' role starts to shift. Because after the Jews are driven out of Jerusalem, and then ultimately
No,
when
66, 67 AD.
in that right in that range
yeah.
of time, you have this rise of the Pharisees in this diaspora that happens as the Jews are moving out and around. You have the Pharisees then that are trying to preserve Judaism in a much larger footprint. It's not just in the small country of Israel, but they're trying to keep people faithful to the law wherever. And now they're living in different cultures. So they're trying to preserve the law and the faithful Jews holding to the law in Corinth and in Ephesus and in other places
Not
like
terribly
that.
easy to do.
Not easy to do. And so anything that was a deviation from that, well, the Pharisees would seek to stop it, would seek to put an end to it, would seek to put restrictions on people if they went and joined that group or even listened to that group.
Right.
And so in the city of Ephesus, you have this Christian sect that's there, that this Christian church that Paul founded, and this Christian community that John is a part of. And you have one of the disciples living there. And so the Pharisees were not pleased with John or the church in Ephesus. And so you have that issue that John's having to deal with that probably flavors his writing a little bit as he talks
Right.
about the Pharisees.
And in the Roman Empire, the Roman Empire would recognize existing religions and allow them to continue to exist.
Right.
But when the Pharisees say Christianity is no longer a denomination of Judaism,
Right.
but rather it's a separate religion, suddenly the Christians found themselves under persecution.
Right.
And so it's the Pharisees, their decision, and they're saying, no, this is not who we are, that would have created even more animosity because suddenly they've been cut off from their ability to legally practice religion.
Absolutely. So, and the Christian church is dealing with it on so many levels. In 64 AD, you have Nero coming to power, and Nero persecutes the Christians without any hindrance. He doesn't have any limit to what he will do in persecuting the Christians. So you have Rome persecuting the Christians, and the Pharisees are saying they're not part of us.
Right.
And so that prompts them to be persecuted.
Yeah.
And I also think that with John living in Ephesus, the whole Pharisee thing also, where his take on the Pharisees may also be maybe flavored a little bit again by the fact that the church in Ephesus was very Pauline.
Mhm.
It was a church of the Apostle Paul.
I mean, Paul wrote to it. I mean, the book of Ephesians.
Book of Ephesians is written to them.
it, yeah.
They loved Paul. And, well, Paul had started out as Saul, a Pharisee. Now, he wasn't a Pharisee in the time of the crucifixion. He wouldn't have been in the Sanhedrin. More than likely, he's not born until around 5 AD in Tarsus, so he wouldn't have had the power yet to have been sitting at that level when Jesus died. And Jesus is condemned by the Sanhedrin and sent to Pilate. But he then takes on the role of the persecutor of the Christians. And he does do that. He is the one who stands and holds the coats of those who are going to stone
Right.
Stephen, the very first martyr of the faith. And
That would have
so
been tough for John.
it would have been very tough for John because John would have known Stephen.
Right.
You know, John would have been one of those hiding from Saul and others like Saul
Sure.
in Jerusalem. And it's, it's to the original disciples that they bring Saul back to, or now Paul back to, and they have to find a way to convince them because they don't really trust that he's changed.
Right.
And so when John is living in Ephesus in a community that is very much formed by the writings and the thinking of Paul, a former Pharisee, and John knows that Peter was the one who was in charge of the church. Peter was the one who was the head of the disciples, the leader of the disciples, and the leader of the faith. I think that flavors how he writes because, again, it's this struggle with Pharisees in his day, the influence of a former Pharisee, and all sort of combining as he writes his gospel.
So a person who may not be as informed, who would pick up the Gospel of John, would look at his writings, because often he'll refer to the Jews, and he's referring to Jewish leaders.
Right.
But a person who's not informed and realizing that John was very Jewish.
Oh, he was absolutely
And
Jewish,
so,
right.
So it's not, they would say, well, that's anti-Semitic.
Mm-hmm.
But John was Jewish. So this was an internal argument that's going on between people who were Jewish, who were trying to define what faith is and have very different opinions.
Right.
But as you're reading it, you would look at it and you go, why would somebody say that?
Yeah.
But it's because it's really, those are his brothers and sisters, literally, as far as his heritage.
Yeah, these are his true people, the Jewish people. I mean, he was Jewish. He was raised in the Jewish faith in Capernaum. There is no part of his gospel when you read it. You see Jesus going and participating, and he and the disciples going to the different festivals. They're there for that. I mean, they're at the Festival of Booths in the city of Jerusalem when Jesus is standing on Temple Mount watching them light these giant goblets of oil that they would put wicks in on these big candle stands on the top of Temple Mount, because everyone would come and build their little lean-to down in the Kidron Valley, and it would get dark. And so they would light these candles, these bowls of oil, so that they would cast light down. Jesus looks up at that and says, I am the light of the world.
The highest point of the ceremony for the Jewish people, and Jesus goes, it's me.
It's me. And yeah,
Don't make a lot of friends that way.
You don't. But I mean, John is there for the Festival of Booths.
Yes.
I mean, so John adhered to the Jewish festivals. Well, we believe that he did that until the temple was gone, until he couldn't go back, until there was nothing that he could return to. And so he always remained faithful to that, because nothing in the writings of Jesus ever told him to stop being faithful to that. And the actions of Jesus, well, they showed him this is what you do. So no, John is never anti-Semitic. Because he is Jewish.
Right.
And he is talking about his people, his struggle, but he's also talking about his Messiah.
Yeah.
The Messiah that came to the Jewish people first, and then we have experienced his love and his grace in the Gentile world as well.
Well, I'm looking forward in the episodes to come, in the time to come, to look and find all these uniquenesses of John as they string throughout.
Absolutely.
So I'm looking forward to that as we go.